right, we're going to move to chapter 7. I think we'll pick up speed a little bit. We'll see what happens. But so back in chapter 5, which is where chapter 7 picks up from. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, complete, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, which is what we will now talk about. But I want to emphasize the fact here that Jesus became the sacrifice himself, being made perfect. He became the source of eternal salvation. That particular point that Jesus himself becomes the sacrifice we'll talk about later, but in all of this discussion of being a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, that actually has some impact, as we'll see as we go through chapter 7. At the end of chapter 6, we have 4 people swear by something greater than themselves, and in all their disputes, an oath is final for confirmation. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath, so that by 2 unchangeable things, 2 promises, the actual promise itself and the promise that he will keep his promise, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. Now, this idea of God making a promise to Abraham, we're going to go back to the book of Genesis and look at the account of Melchizedek, but this episode that he's talking about here with Abraham and the promise came immediately after that in the book of Genesis. So these 2 things are close together in that way. And so here we have in verse 19, as he continued, well, let me pick it up with 17 so you can get the flow. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath that 2 unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold tight to the hope set before us. This is an anchor of the soul, sure and steadfast, and entering into the inner place behind the curtain where Jesus has gone as a forerunner, a scout, on our behalf, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. A couple things here. First of all, hope is the anchor. Hope is the anchor of the soul that we have. So keep that in mind, because this idea of hope is important to these arguments. That's where the perseverance comes from. If you lose hope, you don't persevere. You stop. So the hope is the key, and the hope is the anchor of the soul. He says here that Jesus is the forerunner who has gone into the inner place behind the curtain ahead of us, which we then have the power to do as well. But where is this inner place behind the curtain? That's a question that's going to come up. Where is this inner place behind the curtain? In the minds of the people hearing this, their mind is going to go, because in their day, it was the temple. That's where the curtain is. That's where the Holy of Holies is. That's where the sacrifices are made. The yearly sacrifices are made in the Holy of Holies by the high priest. And that's what their brain is going to here. He's going behind that curtain. And so if we can go behind that curtain too, that's the curtain that we're going behind. He will then later introduce the concept that that's not the curtain he's talking about. But for now, you've got to keep in mind that's where their mind has gone. So now we can move on to what takes place in chapter 7. What he talks about in chapter 7. So we're going to go back to Genesis 14 so we can make sure we've got all the detail there. The setup here is that Abraham and Lot have separated. Lot has moved on to Sodom. And at this time, there were lots of small nations. They were closer to what we would call a city-state, in that it was basically just a city with some territory around it. And so there are lots of these, and there are lots of kings going with them. But as is pretty much always the case, there was a single king that dominated them all from his position. And in this case, we're going to see that as being Chedorlaomer. Now, here's how this story rolls out. Then the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, went out, and they joined battle in the valley of Siddim with Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of Goim, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. And what's going on here is that Chedorlaomer is the big king, and he's got all of those who want to stay on his side with him. But these other 4 kings have had enough of him and are wanting to break free of his influence. And so he says, no, you're not breaking free of my influence. And he marches on them, and they meet here in the valley of Siddim, which is the valley that the Dead Sea is in. So that's where this is taking place. So we move on, verse 10. Now the valley of Siddim was full of bitumen pits, tar pits. And as the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, so we see how this battle's going, some fell into them, and the rest fled into the hill country. So the Dead Sea is, basically speaking, the lowest place on earth that's not in the ocean. So in that valley is surrounded by high cliff-like structures, so that's where they run off to get away. So the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. So they abandoned their camps, and the armies of Chedorlaomer take all of that stuff. And they also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and went their way. So they go and take everybody from Sodom and Gomorrah that they want to make slaves of them, and everything of value from these places. And so they're on the move back to where they came from, which is on the east side of Jordan. So that's where they're all headed back with all of these possessions and all of these captives. Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and of Aner. These were allies of Abram. When Abram heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. So they've moved far up north there. And he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. So Abram pursues the armies of Chedorlaomer, and he divides his force into 2 pieces and attacks them at night, which was also unusual. So he basically raids them at night from 2 sides, creates a lot of chaos, obviously, and is able to defeat them. Once that takes place, verse 16, then he brought back all the possessions, and also brought back his kinsman, Lot, with his possessions, and the women and the people. So all the stuff that they got from Sodom and Gomorrah, he brings it all back. After his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh. That is, the king's valley. So remember, the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah ran off into the hills. So they didn't get captured. So when Abraham comes back with these things, the king of Sodom comes out to meet him, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High. Elyon is what it literally says in the Hebrew, which translates to God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. That's who Elyon is. He's the God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. He is the great God, the God above all gods. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. So all that spoil that he had captured back, he gave Melchizedek a tenth of it. That's where the story ends, as far as Melchizedek goes. Everything we know about Melchizedek is on this slide. So we take from here and have one other thing to point out. Elyon is who Melchizedek is a priest of, God Most High. Abraham has been having a relationship with who? Yahweh. So Yahweh is the personal name of God that Abraham has been having a relationship with. Melchizedek does not know who that is, because Melchizedek, the only reason Abraham knows him as Yahweh is because Yahweh has come to Abraham. So Melchizedek doesn't know who that is. Melchizedek is worshiping the God Most High, which is why verse 22 is important. Abraham says, I have lifted my hand to Yahweh, the Lord, God Most High. So there's where the connection is made. Okay? Possessor of heaven and earth. So Abraham equates the two. Melchizedek would not have been able to have that understanding of Yahweh. He wouldn't have known Yahweh in that sense. Because you have to keep in mind, this is way before Israel, way before any of that stuff. God, there's not been a burning bush where God has proclaimed his name to Moses. None of that has happened. So this is not particularly important to what we're talking about, but I'll just understand where Melchizedek sits in this picture. So now we can go back to Hebrews now that we know this story. So, verse 1, for this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, and to him Abraham apportioned a tenth part of everything. So here we have him basically quoting what we just read in Genesis. And then he explains, he is first, by translation of his name, King of Righteousness. The word Melchizedek comes from two words, king, right. So he was the king right, king of righteousness, as he explains here. Then he is also the king of Salem. So Melchizedek was the high priest worshiping Elyon, but he was also king of Salem. So he was a king of the city of Salem, the area of Salem, and also the high priest of Elyon. So he was king of Salem, that is, king of peace. The word Salem in Hebrew, salam, is peace. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. Melchizedek didn't have a father. Melchizedek didn't have a mother. He has no genealogy, and he never died. Did we learn all of that in Genesis? Yes, we did learn all that in Genesis. From his argument, from the perspective of his argument, all of that is in Genesis. Because where does Melchizedek come from? in this passage. And where does he go to after this is over? When was he born? When did he die? So, from the information that we have in Genesis, Melchizedek was never born and he never died. Because there's no information here about him being born or dying. Okay? And that's going to be the argument. Okay. So just as Jesus was never born and never dies, so it is with Melchizedek. Now, people could say, well, wait, I saw Jesus. Jesus was born and I saw him die. So there's a slight difference here because nobody saw Melchizedek born or die, but people did see Jesus born and die. But from the spiritual perspective, Jesus never was born because of his position as God and never dies. So this is why we go back to chapter 5 and he says, what I've got to say about Melchizedek is hard to understand. This is what he was talking about, because you can't think in practical terms. If you're thinking in practical terms, you're going to tell yourself, well, wait, that's impossible. Melchizedek had to be born and died. Everybody around him was born and died. But he's not arguing it that way. He's arguing it a different way. He's arguing it from a spiritual perspective. He's spiritualizing it. This is something that starts happening a lot as the church moves down the road. And you have to start figuring out what is the spiritual explanation for this versus what is the practical explanation of this, and which one am I supposed to pay attention to? By the type that the writer of the book of Hebrews is establishing, that's what he's trying to say. And that's how he wants us to see it. But he understood when he started this that his audience's brain wouldn't work that way. And that's why he said, I have this thing to say about Melchizedek, but it's hard for you to understand. You have to think more and beyond. Now remember, he told them, y'all are stuck on just getting saved. Y'all aren't at this point understanding anything beyond the very practical aspects of what we've been talking about. Now I'm going to take you to a different level. And that's hard to understand if you don't follow, if you're not progressing, if you're not growing and able to see beyond just what's right in front of your face. That's what he was talking about when we got to that point. That's why he took out a whole chapter to talk about that and how they need to get further than where they were to understand what he's about to tell them about Melchizedek. He goes on. See how great this man was to Abraham, to whom Abraham, the patriarch, gave a tenth of the spoils. Melchizedek must have been a very great man, a very great representative, high priest, king, because Jews had two people that were superior to every man who had ever lived: Moses and Abraham. And here Abraham is giving a tenth to Melchizedek. Abraham is in effect reverencing Melchizedek as greater than himself. So if Abraham was great, Melchizedek had to be greater. So see how great this man was to whom Abraham the patriarch gave a tenth of the spoils. And those descendants of Levi who receive the priestly office have a commandment in the law to take tithes from the people, that is, from their brothers, though these also are descended from Abraham. So now he's pulling back. He says, I want you to look at your high priests. Your high priests are who? Your brothers. They're just like you. If they're greater than you, they're only a little greater than you. So he's drawing the contrast here between the Levitical priests that they all know and the reverence that Abraham had for Melchizedek as greater than himself. But this man, Melchizedek, who does not have his descent from them, received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. You are commanded in the law to give tithes to the Levitical priests. But this man, Melchizedek, wasn't a Levitical priest. And yet here Abraham is giving him tithes. It is beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior. So here he says outright, Abraham was inferior to Melchizedek. That's why he gave him tithes. In the one case, tithes are received by mortal men. The Levitical priests are mortal men receiving tithes from the Jewish people. But in the other case, by one of whom it is testified that he lives. Melchizedek lives still, is what he's saying here. So the tithes are being received not by a mortal, but one who's still alive. One might even say that Levi himself, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him. So carrying the argument even further, all those Levitical priests that you've been giving tithes to gave their tithes to Melchizedek through the descent from Abraham. So when Abraham gave tithes, it was like them giving tithes to Melchizedek. Inferior, superior. Get the argument there? The Levitical priests are inferior to Melchizedek because they gave him tithes. Okay, that's his argument. Now, if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need would there have been for another priest to arise after the order of Melchizedek, rather than one named after the order of Aaron? There was no need for any other priest to come after the law. You got to keep your perspective here. There's another one who has come after the law, after the order of Melchizedek. Who is that? Jesus. Okay, keep that connection. So if the law had worked and the sacrifices of the Levitical priest had worked, would we need another priest? No. That's what he's saying. For when there is a change in the priesthood, there is necessarily a change in the law as well. So if the priesthood, if you're changing from one priesthood to another priesthood, the Levitical priests were doing what was in what? The law given to Moses for the children of Israel. This new priest, after the order of Melchizedek, what that all happened before. Melchizedek was way before the law, so he's not part of that law. So if you change from these priests to that priest, what are you also doing away with? The law. Because now you're following the order of Melchizedek, not the order of the Levitical priest. Okay? Everybody following? For the one of whom these things are spoken belonged to another tribe, from which no one has ever served at the altar. For it is evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, and in connection with that tribe, Moses said nothing about priests. We've already talked about this. Jesus couldn't be a high priest. Why? He was from the tribe of Judah. He wasn't from the tribe of Levi. But he was a high priest. Why? Because he's not even part of that whole order. He's from a different order, the order of Melchizedek. Now, something I've told you before. Melchizedek was two things, not one. He was the high priest who was worthy of tithes, who brought the bread and wine, but he was also the king of Salem. So he was fulfilling two roles. He was fulfilling two roles that had become part of the teaching of the Jews at this point that were fulfilled by messiahs. Two messiahs. A priestly messiah and a political messiah. And Melchizedek fulfills both of those things, and here is Jesus in the order of Melchizedek. And so he is, even though he was born in the tribe of Judah, which would make him legally able to be the king of the Jews, he was also a priest, a high priest, in the order of Melchizedek, because he was two things at once. So there's his argument. He's laid it out. It is evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, and in connection with that tribe, Moses said nothing about priests. This becomes even more evident when another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek. Now, where's this idea that there can be another priest after the order of Melchizedek coming from? Well, Melchizedek only shows up in two places in the Bible. We saw the one in Genesis, and we've already talked about the other one, and that's in Psalm 110, because he's talked about Psalm 110 a couple of times before now, and now he goes back to it. This becomes even more evident when another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become a priest not on the basis of a legal requirement concerning bodily descent, but by the power of an indestructible life, an ongoing, never-ending life. Now, is he talking about Melchizedek or Jesus? He's talking about them both in the same way. For it is witnessed of him in Psalm 110, you, who's he talking to in Psalm 110? The Messiah. So in Psalm 110, we see the Messiah being told, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And he's already made that argument a few chapters before. So now he's bringing it all together. Jesus is a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. The Messiah is a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, and the king. For it is witnessed of him, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. For on the one hand, a former commandment is set aside. The law is set aside because of its weakness and uselessness. For the law made nothing perfect. It never finished anything. But on the other hand, a better hope is introduced through which we draw near to God. We'll stop there. We can get through the rest of this chapter pretty quickly because it's pretty straightforward. The idea is the law couldn't finish this thing. Because the law, if the law could have finished, the priest offering the sacrifices would have done the job. But those priests, this kind of preview to what we're going to see at the end of the chapter here, those priests did what that the priest after the order of Melchizedek didn't do. They stopped offering sacrifices, and why? Because they all died. So they could never finish the job because they had to go back every year, and eventually they died. This priest doesn't do that. He offers the sacrifice, and he stays around. So that's where we're going with this. We'll pick it up there next week.